The Debt of the Obsidian Throne. Chapter 1. The Dead of Winter. The wind didn't just blow in the Blackwood Valley. It screamed. It tore at the frayed edges of Elara's wool coat as she stood before the iron gates of Thorne Manor. The estate sat atop the jagged cliffs like a predator carved from obsidian, its windows staring down at the village below with cold, judgmental eyes. Elara clutched the envelope in her hand. The parchment felt heavy, slick with the scent of expensive cedar and something metallic, like dried ink or old blood. It was a summons. Her father's gambling debts had finally reached the ears of the man the locals called the Vulture of the North. The gates groaned open without a visible hand to touch them. The entry. The interior of the manor was a tomb of opulence. Massive chandeliers hung like frozen rain from vaulted ceilings, casting long, dancing shadows across the velvet-lined walls. "You're late," a voice drifted from the top of the grand staircase. It wasn't a loud voice, but it had a gravity that seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. Alaric Thorne descended slowly. He was dressed in charcoal silk, his movements possessing the fluid, dangerous grace of a panther. His eyes were the color of a winter sea just before a storm, gray, turbulent, and freezing. "The snow slowed my horse, my lord," Elara whispered, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain still. Alaric stopped on the final step, placing him inches from her. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back, exposing the delicate line of her throat. He tracked the movement, his gaze lingering there a second too long. "Your father sold your life to save his own," Alaric said, his voice dropping to a low melodic rasp. "Do you understand the terms, Elara? You do not leave these grounds. You belong to the house. You belong to the debt." The first night. He led her to a room that was less a bedroom and more a velvet prison. The bed was a sprawling expanse of midnight blue, and the fireplace roared with a heat that felt aggressive rather than welcoming. "I am not a kind man," Alaric said, standing in the doorway, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the hallway light. "Do not look for mercy in these walls. If you try to run, the forest will claim you. If you stay, I will." He stepped into her personal space, the scent of sandalwood and rain-dampened earth enveloping her. He reached out, his gloved thumb brushing the curve of her lower lip. The contact was electric, a spark of pure, unadulterated fear mixed with a traitorous jolt of heat that settled deep in her chest. "Dinner is at 8, he whispered, his breath ghosting over her skin. "Wear the dress I left on the bed. I want to see how much your father's greed cost me in gold." Chapter 2. The Feast of Shadows. Elara stood at the threshold, the silk dress Alaric had provided feeling like a second skin, and a heavy one. It was a deep bruised violet, the fabric clinging to her, curves and baring her shoulders, to the drafty chill of the manor. The corset was laced so tight she could only take shallow, fluttering breaths, making her feel as though she were constantly on the verge of a faint. At the far end of the table, Alaric was already seated. He didn't look up from his wine. The dark liquid swirled in his glass, reflecting the flickering orange glow of the fire. "Sit," he commanded. The word was a physical weight. Elara moved to the chair opposite him, her heels clicking rhythmically against the stone floor. As she sat, the distance between them felt like a canyon. Yet his gaze, when it finally rose to meet hers, bridged it instantly. The inspection. He didn't eat. He simply watched her. Every time Elara lifted her silver fork, she felt the predatory focus of his eyes tracking the movement of her wrist, the way her throat swallowed, the slight tremble of her fingers. "The color suits you," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "It makes you look fragile, like a bird that's realized the bars of its cage are made of something much stronger than wood." "Is that what I am to you, my lord?" "A trophy for your collection." Elara forced herself to meet his stare. She had to find the man beneath the monster, or she would lose herself entirely. Alaric leaned forward, the light catching the sharp angles of his cheekbones. "A trophy is static. You are a debt, Elara, and interest on a debt like yours. It grows every hour you spend under my roof. The power play." He stood up, his tall frame casting a shadow that swallowed the table. He walked toward her, the slow, deliberate pace of a man who knew his prey had nowhere to go. He stopped behind her chair. Elara froze. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the scent of expensive tobacco and cold mountain air. He leaned down, his lips inches from the shell of her ear. "You haven't touched your wine," he murmured. I prefer to keep my wits, she replied, her pulse thundering in her neck. A wise choice. But here your wits are your worst enemy. They tell you to fear me. They tell you to run. He reached around her, his hand covering hers where it rested on the table. His skin was hot, his grip firm. He guided her hand to the stem of the glass. But you won't run? Because you want to know why I chose your father's debt specifically. You want to know what I plan to do with you. He tilted her head back with his free hand, his fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of her neck. It wasn't gentle, but it wasn't quite cruel, it was possessive. Tell me, Elara, he whispered, his eyes dark with an intensity that bordered on madness. Do you feel the debt? Does it burn you as much as it burns me to look at you? The breaking point. He let go abruptly, stepping back into the shadows. The sudden absence of his touch felt like a cold shock. Finish your meal, he said, his tone returning to a frigid, businesslike clip. Tomorrow your education begins. You will learn the history of this house, and you will learn your place within it. I do not tolerate disobedience, but I find I rather enjoy resistance. He turned and vanished into the darkness of the hallway, leaving Elara alone with the dying fire and the realization that the man who owned her was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Chapter 3. The Secret Library. The manor breathed. That was the only way Elara could describe. The low hum of the wind through the stone corridors. It was midnight and her room felt like a velvet coffin. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. She wasn't wearing the violet dress now, only a thin, white silk shift that felt like a spider's web against her skin. She needed answers. The discovery. At the end of the north wing, she found a door hidden behind a heavy tapestry. It wasn't locked. Inside was a library that smelled of ancient paper and something sharp like ozone. She lit a single candle. The light flickered over rows of leather-bound books, but her eyes were drawn to a desk in the center. Laid out were maps of her village, sketches of her father's shop, and her. There were charcoal drawings of her at the market, her hair windblown, drawings of her sleeping by the river. These weren't recent. Some were years old. I see you've found the archives, a voice rasped from the shadows. The confrontation. Alaric emerged from the dark, leaning against a bookshelf. He was shirtless, his chest a map of scars, some jagged, some surgical. He looked less like a lord and more like a warrior who had barely survived a war. You've been watching me, Elara whispered, the candle shaking in her hand. For years. This wasn't a random debt. You targeted my father. Alaric walked toward her, the heat of his body cutting through her thin silk shift. He took the candle from her hand and set it on the desk, plunging them into amber semi-darkness. He trapped her between his arms, leaning in until his forehead touched hers. Your father took everything from me when I was a boy, he growled, his hand sliding up to cup her jaw, his thumb pressing firmly against her pulse point. I didn't just want his money, Elara. I wanted his most precious jewel. I wanted the only thing that would make him suffer the way I did. So I'm just revenge to you? She challenged, her breath hitching as his hand moved to the nape of her neck, pulling her closer until their lips were a hair's breadth apart. In the beginning, yes, Alaric murmured, his eyes scanning her face with a hunger that made her knees weak. But now? Now I can't decide if I want to break you, or if I want to burn the rest of the world down, just to keep you in this room. He leaned down, his lips brushing the sensitive skin just below her ear. Go back to your room, Elara, before I forget that I'm supposed to be your captor and start acting like your owner. Chapter 4. The First Lesson. The morning sun did not bring warmth to Thorne Manor. It only illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden ghosts. Elara woke to the sound of a heavy bolt sliding back. A maid entered in silence, laying out a garment of such structured severity that it looked more like armor than silk. It was a gown of midnight emerald, with a high collar of black lace that felt like a hand around her throat. His lordship expects you in the great hall at noon, the maid whispered, refusing to meet Elara's eyes. The investors have arrived. Elara spent the morning pacing her room. She realized Alaric wasn't just keeping her as a prisoner. He was refining her. He was whetting her like a blade. When the clock struck 12, she descended the stairs. The lion's den. The great hall was filled with men who smelled of cigars and old money. They were the iron barons and shipping, magnates of the north, men who broke lives for profit. At the head of the table sat Alaric, He looked different today. His hair was slicked back, his suit impeccable, his expression a mask of bored cruelty. As Elara entered, the room fell silent. The weight of a dozen predatory gazes landed on her. She felt exposed despite the heavy silk. "Gentlemen!" Alaric's voice rang out, smooth as velvet and sharp as a razor. "This is Elara. She will be handling the logistics of the Blackwood acquisition. Any questions regarding the ledger go through her." A man with a bloated face and a gold watch sneered. "A debt girl? You expect us to trust the numbers of a village? Girl whose father couldn't even count his own losses." The air in the room turned arctic. Alaric didn't move, but the tension in his shoulders shifted. He looked at Elara, a silent challenge in his eyes. "Defend yourself or be devoured." Elara stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She picked up the ledger from the table, her eyes scanning the columns. She remembered her father's messy books, but these were Alaric's. They were a masterpiece of manipulation. "Mr. Sterling, I believe," Elara said, her voice steadying. She pointed to a line on the page. "You're concerned about my father's math, yet you've overlooked the 15% discrepancy in your own shipping, manifests from the last quarter. If you're suggesting this house is incapable of management, perhaps we should discuss why your ships are arriving half empty in the southern ports." The room went deathly quiet. Sterling's face turned a mottled purple. Alaric's lips curled into a faint, dangerous smile. It was the first time she had seen him look pleased. The private toll. After the men had been dismissed, slinking away like beaten curs, Alaric remained at the table. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. "Come here," he said. It wasn't a request. Elara walked to him, her legs feeling like lead. As she reached his side, he reached out, his fingers hooking into the lace of her collar and pulling her down until she was forced to lean over him. "You have a sharp tongue, Elara. I wonder if it's as sharp when you're not defending your pride," he murmured. His gaze dropped to her mouth, lingering there with a heavy, suffocating heat. "You threw me to them," she whispered, her face inches from his. "You wanted to see them tear me apart." "I wanted to see you bite back," Alaric corrected. He stood up, never releasing his grip on her collar. He backed her against the heavy oak table, his body a solid wall of heat and muscle pressing against her silk skirts. "In this house, you are either the wolf or the lamb. I have no use for a lamb." He leaned in, his nose brushing against hers. The scent of him, smoke, cedar, and something uniquely masculine, invaded her senses, making her head spin. His hand moved from her collar to the small of her back, crushing her against him. The physical contact was an electric shock, a chaotic blend of hatred for her captor and a terrifying, primal attraction to the power he radiated. "You're hurting me," she lied. She wasn't in pain. She was in flames. "I haven't even begun to hurt you," Alaric rasped, his eyes darkening until they were almost black. He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb, his touch possessive and bruising. "You think you've won a point today, but every time you prove how valuable you are, you only make me want to tighten the leash. You're making yourself indispensable." "Elara, do you realize how dangerous that is for a prisoner?" He let her go so suddenly she stumbled against the table. He finished his drink in one swallow and walked toward the tall windows, looking out at the encroaching storm. "Tonight we ride to the edge of the estate," he said, his back to her. "The lesson is over. Now I want to see how you handle the dark." Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. The ride was a descent into a frozen purgatory. The horse's hooves crunched through the crust of the snow, the only sound in the oppressive silence of the Blackwood forest. Alaric rode ahead, a dark shadow against the white landscape. The ambush. They reached the gorge when the first shot rang out. It was a sharp, cracking sound that shattered the stillness. Alaric's horse reared, screaming in terror. Elara watched in horror as a spray of crimson painted the white snow. Alaric fell, his body disappearing into a drift. "Alaric!" The name tore from her throat before she could think to suppress it. 3 men emerged from the tree line, hired assassins, eyes cold and hungry. They didn't care about the girl. They wanted the head of the Vulture. Elara slid from her horse, her boots sinking deep into the cold. She scrambled toward where Alaric lay. He was conscious, but his shoulder was a mess of torn wool and blood. His face was deathly pale, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles jumped. "Run!" he wheezed, his hand fumbling for the pistol at his hip. "Elara, go." She looked at the men approaching. She looked at the man who had imprisoned her, who had used her as a pawn, who had watched her like a hawk, and then she looked at the heavy silver pistol that had fallen from his grip. The choice. She didn't run. She picked up the weapon. It was heavier than she expected, the metal biting into her cold palm. As the first assassin reached them, his blade raised, Elara didn't hesitate. She fired. The kickback nearly dislocated her shoulder, but the man dropped. The other two paused, stunned that the debt girl was fighting back. That pause was their undoing. Alaric, fueled by a sudden violent burst of adrenaline, drew a hidden knife from his boot and lunged. The struggle was brief and brutal. When it was over, the snow was no longer white. The aftermath. Alaric slumped against a tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Elara knelt beside him, her hands shaking so violently she had to press them against her thighs. She tore a strip of silk from her expensive petticoat, reaching for his wound. "You stayed," Alaric whispered, his voice cracking. He looked up at her, and for the first time the mask of the monster was gone. In its place was a raw, terrifying vulnerability. "Why did you stay?" "You could have let them kill me. You would have been free." Elara pressed the cloth to his shoulder, hearing his sharp intake of breath. She looked him in the eyes, her own filled with a dark, complicated fire. "Because," she whispered, leaning closer until her lips were near his ear, mimicking the way he always spoke to her. "I'm not finished with you yet, Alaric Thorne. You don't get to die until I say the debt is paid." A ghost of a laugh escaped him, followed by a wince of pain. He reached up with his good hand, his blood-stained fingers tangling in her hair, pulling her face down to his. "Then pray for my recovery," he rasped. "Because if I live through the night, I'm going to make you regret saving me." Chapter 6, The Midnight Ball. The recovery was not a period of rest. It was a period of sharpening. For 3 days, Alaric remained behind the heavy oak doors of his study, the scent of antiseptic and bitter herbs clinging to the hallway. When he finally emerged, he was thinner, his eyes sunken but burning with a renewed predatory light. He didn't speak of the attack. He spoke of the ball. "The world believes I am bleeding," he had told Elara, his voice a low vibration in the dimly lit hall. "Tonight we will show them that I have never been more dangerous. And you, Elara, you will be the reason they cannot look away." The transformation. The preparation was an ordeal in itself. Alaric had summoned a dressmaker from the capital, a woman who spoke in clipped tones and handled Elara as if she were a piece of Carrara marble. The result was a gown that felt less like clothing and more like a declaration of war. It was crafted from obsidian silk so fine it rippled like water, with a bodice encrusted in raw garnets that looked like drying droplets of blood. The back was non-existent, lacing up with thin gold chains that bit into her skin, reminding her with every movement that she was tethered. When Elara finally stepped into Alaric's private chambers for his inspection, the air seemed to leave the room. He was standing by the window, dressed in a black doublet with silver embroidery that caught the moonlight. His arm was still bound beneath his coat, but he carried himself with a terrifying, rigid grace. He walked toward her, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He didn't speak at first. He circled her, his gaze traveling from the crown of her braided hair down the curve of her spine, exposed by the gold chains. "You look like a nightmare dressed as a dream," he whispered. Stopping behind her, he reached into a velvet box on his desk and pulled out a choker. It was a wide band of black lace centered with a diamond the size of a bird's egg. He stepped close, his heat enveloping her, and fastened it around her neck. "A leash of light for my darkest prize." His fingers lingered on the nape of her neck, his thumb tracing the sensitive skin just above the lace. Elara felt a shiver that wasn't from the cold. "They will hate me," she whispered, looking at their reflection in the tall mirror. They looked like a pair of beautiful fallen deities. "Let them," Alaric rasped, his eyes meeting hers in the glass. "Hatred is just another form of obsession. And tonight you belong to the man they fear most." The descent. The great ballroom was a cathedral of light and sound. Hundreds of candles flickered in the massive chandeliers, reflecting off the masks of the guests. It was a masquerade, a sea of gold lions, silver foxes, and porcelain dolls. But when Alaric Thorne appeared at the top of the grand staircase with Elara on his arm, the music didn't just falter, it died. Alaric didn't wear a mask. He wanted them to see his face, to see the cold vitality in his eyes. Elara wore a half mask of black filigree, highlighting the defiance in her gaze. They descended the stairs in a silence so profound it was deafening. Every eye in the room was a weapon, every whisper a poison. Elara could feel the weight of their judgment. The way the women looked at her with a mix of envy and horror, and how the men looked at her with a hunger that made her skin crawl. "Smile, Elara," Alaric murmured, his hand tightening on her waist, pulling her so flush against his side that she could feel the steady, rhythmic thrum of his heart. "Let them wonder why the girl who should be weeping is standing like a queen." The Dance of Shadows. The orchestra began a waltz, a dark, minor key arrangement that felt like a funeral march played at double speed. Alaric led her to the center of the floor. The other couples cleared away, creating a circle of isolation. As they danced, the world blurred. There was only the pressure of Alaric's hand on the small of her back and the intense, suffocating focus of his stare. He moved with a deceptive ease, hiding the pain of his wound, using the dance to pull her closer and closer until their breath mingled. "They are watching for a sign of weakness," Alaric said, his voice barely audible over the violins. He spun her, his hand sliding up her arm to catch her fingers. "They want to see if I falter. They want to see if you will break." "And if I do?" Elara asked, her heart racing. "I won't let you fall," he replied, his grip turning bruisingly firm as he pulled her back into his chest. "Not because I am kind, but because you are mine. And I do not lose what is mine." Suddenly the music swelled and Alaric dipped her low. For a moment, suspended over the polished floor, Elara looked up at him. The mask of the Cold Lord had slipped again, replaced by a raw, hungry desperation. He looked like a man starving, and she was the only thing that could sate him. He brought her back up, his face inches from hers. The tension between them was a physical cord stretched to the point of snapping. "You're trembling," he noted, his voice thick with a dark satisfaction. "I'm cold," she lied, though she was burning. "No," Alaric whispered, his hand sliding up to her throat, his thumb resting against her racing pulse. "You're waking up. Elara. You're realizing that the cage doesn't just keep you in, it keeps the rest of the world out." The dance ended and the room erupted into polite, hollow applause. But before Alaric could lead her away, a man stepped forward from the crowd. He wore a mask of a weeping willow, but Elara recognized the voice instantly. It was Julian, Alaric's brother, the man she suspected of the ambush. "A lovely performance, brother," Julian said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "But be careful. Sometimes the bird you cherish most is the one that pecks out your eyes while you sleep." Alaric's expression went stone cold. He stepped in front of Elara, shielding her with his body. The air in the ballroom turned lethal. "Julian," Alaric said, his voice a low, terrifying growl, "I suggest you leave before I decide that this floor needs a new shade of red." The adrenaline of the ballroom was replaced by a hollow, ringing silence as Elara fled the main hall. She didn't head for her room. She couldn't bear the thought of sitting in that velvet-lined cage waiting for Alaric to come for her, his eyes full of that dark, possessive hunger. Instead, she took a service staircase, her obsidian skirts hissing against the cold stone like a warning. Chapter 7. The Ghost in the Walls. She found herself in the East Wing, a part of the manor that remained unlit, untouched by the warmth of the evening's festivities. Here the air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of lavender and rot. The wallpaper was peeling in long, curled strips, revealing the gray stone beneath like shedding skin. Elara held a silver candle holder she had snatched from a hallway table. The flame flickered wildly, casting elongated, distorted shadows that seemed to reach for her from the corners. This was the part of Thorne Manor that Alaric kept hidden, the part that hadn't been polished into a weapon. The Forbidden Gallery. At the end of a long, drafty corridor stood a door of heavy ironwood, bolted not from the outside to keep someone in, but from the inside to keep something out. It was slightly ajar, the lock broken as if by a violent force years ago. Elara pushed it open. The room was a gallery, but every piece of furniture was draped in ghostly white sheets. Dust lay thick on the floor, disturbed only by the draft. She moved deeper into the room, her candlelight catching the edges of heavy gold frames lining the walls. These were portraits, but they had all been turned toward the wall, their faces hidden in shame or grief. Except for one, at the very end of the hall, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight piercing through a cracked skylight, stood a massive canvas. It was the only one left facing the room. Elara stopped. The candle holder nearly slipped from her numb fingers. The woman in the portrait was wearing a dress of cream silk, her hair pinned up with pearls. But it wasn't the clothes that made Elara's breath catch in her throat, it was the face. The same high, defiant cheekbones, the same slight curve to the lower lip, the same almond-shaped eyes that seemed to hold a secret they were desperate to share. "It's me," Elara whispered, the words sounding like a sacrilege in the silence, but it couldn't be. The oil paint was cracked with age. The woman in the painting was holding a rose, her fingers resting exactly where Elara's own hand now flew to her chest, the voice in the dark. Her name was Serafina, a voice grated from the doorway. Elara spun around. Alaric stood there, his silhouette framed by the rotting corridor. He hadn't changed out of his formal clothes, but he had discarded his coat. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the throat, and the bandage on his shoulder was beginning to bloom with a fresh, dark stain of red. He didn't look angry. He looked haunted. "Who was she?" Elara demanded, her voice trembling. "Why does she have my face, Alaric? Is this why I'm here? Am I just a ghost to fill a gap in your gallery?" Alaric walked toward her, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic. He didn't stop until he was standing right in front of the portrait, his back to Elara. He reached out, his long fingers hovering just inches from the painted woman's cheek. "She was my mother's sister," he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "And she was the woman your father was supposed to marry before he betrayed this family, before he stole the Thorne dowry and left her to wither in this house." He turned to Elara then, and the look in his eyes was a terrifying mixture of loathing and worship. He stepped into her space, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. "You aren't a ghost, Elara," he whispered, reaching out to grip her chin, forcing her to look up at him. "You are the living retribution. I didn't just want a girl to settle a debt. I wanted her bloodline back in this house. I wanted the face that destroyed my father to be the one that kneels before me, the breaking point." Elara felt a surge of cold fury. She slapped his hand away, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the empty gallery. "You're insane. You've built a temple to a grudge that's older than I am. I am not her. I will never be her." Alaric's jaw tightened, the muscles jumping. He didn't strike back. Instead, he moved with that sudden, predatory speed, pinning her against the frame of the portrait. The cold gold of the frame bit into her back. "You're right," he growled, his face inches from hers. "She was soft. She was a victim. But you have fire in your veins. You have the spite of a survivor." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was hot, smelling of wine and iron. "The more you fight me, the more you remind me that you are real, and that makes me want to lock you in this wing and never let the sun touch your skin again." "Is that what you want?" Elara challenged, her heart thundering against her ribs. "To own a statue?" "I want the woman who saved my life in the woods," Alaric whispered, his hand sliding down to her waist, pulling her so hard against him that she could feel every line of his body. "And I want the woman who looked at my brother with enough ice to freeze the hell he came from. I want all of you, Elara, every dark corner of your soul." For a moment, the hatred between them shifted into something else, a volatile, chemical reaction that made the air feel electric. Elara reached up, her fingers trembling as they brushed the bloodstain on his shirt. She should have pushed him away. She should have run. Instead, she gripped the fabric, pulling him closer. "Then take me out of this graveyard," she whispered defiantly. "If you want me, Alaric, stop looking at the walls and look at me." Alaric's eyes went dark, the gray turning to charcoal. Without a word, he swept her up into his arms, his grip possessive and absolute, and carried her out of the east wing, leaving the ghost of Serafina to watch them disappear into the shadows. The fire in Alaric's master suite had burned down to a low, pulsing orange glow. The room was vast, filled with the scent of expensive bourbon and the metallic tang of Alaric's blood from his reopened wound. He lay across the sprawling bed, deep in a sleep brought on by exhaustion and the heavy sedatives the estate doctor had forced upon him. Elara stood by the bed for a long time, watching the way his chest rose and fell. Even in sleep, his brow was furrowed as if he were fighting a war behind his eyelids. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the dark hair spilled across the pillow, before she pulled back. She couldn't afford to feel for him, not yet. Chapter 8, The Truth Revealed. The key to Alaric's private safe wasn't hidden. He wore it on a silver chain around his neck. With a hand that shook like a leaf in a storm, Elara leaned over him. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin. Her breath hitched as she carefully unhooked the clasp, her knuckles brushing the pulse point in his throat. He stirred, a low groan escaping his lips, but he didn't wake. She retreated to the corner of the room, where a heavy iron-bound chest sat, partially concealed by a velvet curtain. The key turned with a heavy, satisfying clunk. The paper trail. Inside were not gold bars or jewels, but stacks of correspondence and a single, leather-bound ledger with the Thorne crest embossed in fading gold. This was the Book of Debts. Elara sat on the floor, the cold stone biting through her silk skirts, and began to read. She expected to see her father's signature on a dozen fraudulent loans. She expected to see proof of the theft that had ruined Alaric's family. But as she flipped through the yellowed pages, the knot in her stomach tightened into a hard, cold ball. The entries from 20 years ago weren't in Alaric's sharp, precise hand. They were in the flowing, arrogant script of his father, Silas Thorne. There, documented with a chilling lack of emotion, was the truth. Her father hadn't stolen the dowry. Silas Thorne had systematically embezzled the funds from his own family's estate to cover his mounting gambling losses in the capital. Then came the letters. Silas had written to a crooked magistrate, instructing him to plant the evidence in the Blackwood family's workshop. "The girl's father is a fool and a drunk," the letter read. "He will make a perfect scapegoat. By the time the auditors arrive, the Blackwood name will be synonymous with thievery, and my accounts will be balanced by their blood." Elara felt the air leave her lungs. Her father hadn't been a thief. He had been a victim of a man far more powerful and cruel than he could ever be. Alaric's entire life, his coldness, his obsession, his justified cruelty toward her, was built on a foundation of sand and lies. The shadow in the mirror. "You were never supposed to open that." The voice was like a gunshot. Elara gasped, the ledger slamming shut as she scrambled to her feet. Alaric was sitting up, his eyes wide and wild, the shadows of the room making him look like a phantom. He was pale, his shirt hanging open, the bandages on his shoulder stark white against his skin. He wasn't looking at her with anger. He was looking at the ledger with a primal, naked fear. "You knew," Elara whispered, her voice cracking. She held the book up like a shield. "You knew your father framed mine. You knew the debt was a lie." Alaric swung his legs over the side of the bed, his movements jerky and pained. He stood up, swaying slightly. "I didn't know. Not at first. I found that book 6 months ago, after I had already set the plan in motion to bring you here." "And you didn't stop?" Elara screamed, the tears finally breaking free. "You let me believe my father was a criminal. You let me live in fear. You treated me like a piece of property to settle a score that didn't exist." Alaric moved toward her, his face a mask of agony. He reached out, but she backed away until she hit the cold stone wall. "I couldn't stop," he rasped, his voice breaking. "Because by the time I found the truth, I was already obsessed with you. If I told you the truth, you would leave. You would hate me more than you already did. I thought if I kept you here long enough, if I made you love me, the truth wouldn't matter. It matters." Elara spat, her eyes burning with a dark, vengeful light. "Everything you've done to me, every touch, every word, it's all tainted by this. You're not a man seeking justice, Alaric. You're just a jailer who fell in love with his prisoner, the new power." Alaric stopped, his head bowing. He looked defeated. The great Vulture of the North brought to his knees by a book of ink and paper. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice a hollow shell of itself. Elara looked down at the ledger, then back at the man who had stolen her freedom. A new, dangerous strength surged through her. She realized she held his entire world in her hands. If she took this to the authorities, or even to the rival families, Alaric would be ruined. He would lose the manor, his title, and his life. She walked toward him, her footsteps slow and deliberate. She stopped when she was inches from him, the ledger pressed against his chest. "I'm not leaving," she whispered, her voice cold and sharp as a winter frost. Alaric looked up, hope flickering in his eyes, a hope that was quickly extinguished by her next words. "I'm staying, but not as your prisoner, and not as your debt girl. From this moment on, you are the one in debt to me, Alaric Thorne. You will give me everything. You will open every door, every account, and every secret. You will be my weapon, or I will use this book to burn your house to the ground." Alaric's breath hitched. He looked at her, Truly looked at her and saw the monster he had created. He saw the fire he had spent weeks stoking, and he realized it was finally going to consume him. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched her cheek. "I am already yours, Elara. I have been since the moment you fired that gun in the woods. Do with me what you will." He sank to his knees before her, his forehead resting against her waist. It was a total submission, a shift in power so absolute it made the air in the room vibrate with tension. The shift in the manor was instantaneous. The servants who had once looked at Elara with pity now moved with a frantic, wide-eyed terror. They saw the way the Vulture followed her, not as a master but as a shadow. Alaric Thorne, the man who had frozen the hearts of kings, now sat at the foot of his own table while Elara sat at the head. The ledger opened before her like a holy text. Chapter 9, The Hunt, Inverted. The morning was gray and biting. Elara stood on the balcony, her hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had gone cold. She didn't mind the chill. She felt like she was made of ice herself. Alaric appeared behind her. He was dressed for the elements. Heavy leather, fur-lined cloak, and the twin pistols strapped to his thighs. He looked like the personification of death. Yet when he approached her, he stopped 2 paces back, waiting for permission to speak. "The names have been verified," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "The magistrate, the clerk, and the captain of the guard. They are all still alive, living off the blood money my father paid them to ruin yours." Elara turned, her obsidian eyes meeting his. "And where are they?" "Hiding in the fog of the lowlands. They heard the rumors of what happened in the woods." "They know I'm coming." "No," Elara corrected, stepping toward him until the toes of her boots brushed his. She reached up, adjusting the collar of his cloak with a chillingly domestic slowness. "We are coming. I want to see their faces when they realize the debt has come to collect." The lowland descent. They rode out within the hour. The lowlands were a labyrinth of salt marshes and rotting piers, a place where the law didn't exist and secrets were buried in the silt. As they tracked the first man, the former magistrate, a man named Vane, Elara watched Alaric. He moved with a terrifying efficiency. He didn't speak. He simply dismantled anyone who stood in their way. But every time a blade was drawn or a shot was fired, he positioned himself as a human shield between the world and Elara. It wasn't protection born of gallantry. It was the desperate, clawing need of a man trying to prove his worth to a woman who had every right to kill him. The confrontation. They found Vane in a tavern that smelled of sour ale and desperation. He was an old man now, bloated and shaking, but the gold rings on his fingers were still bright, the price of Elara's father's soul. Alaric didn't hesitate. He kicked the table over, pinning Vane against the wall with a forearm across his throat. The tavern went silent as the regulars saw the thorn crest. "Please," Vane whimpered, his eyes bulging. "Silas promised me protection." "He promised—" "Silas is dead," Alaric growled, the sound vibrating with a lethal promise. "And his promises died with him. You are standing before the daughter of the man you broke." Alaric stepped back, looking at Elara. He drew his serrated hunting knife and held it out to her. "Handle first." The blade caught the dim light, silver and cruel. "He is the first name on your list." "Elara," Alaric whispered, his eyes searching hers with a feverish intensity. "Tell me what you want done. Should I take his hands, his tongue, or do you want the pleasure of ending the lie yourself?" The test. Elara looked at the knife, then at the pathetic, weeping man before her. She felt the power coursing through her, a dark, intoxicating nectar. She could end it here. She could make Alaric a murderer for her sake, further binding him to her in blood. She took the knife from Alaric's hand. The weight of it was grounding. She walked up to Vane, the tip of the blade tracing the line of his throat, drawing a single tiny bead of crimson. "The money," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Where is the rest of what Silas paid you?" In the floorboards, under the hearth." Vane gasped. "Get it," she commanded Alaric. Alaric didn't blink. He went to the hearth, tore up the rotted wood with his bare hands, and pulled out a heavy iron box. He brought it to her, kneeling in the dirt of the tavern floor to present it. Elara looked down at Alaric. He was covered in soot and blood, the most powerful man in the north, kneeling in the filth because she had told him to. "I don't want his life," Elara said, her voice carrying through the room. "Death is too quick. I want him to live in the same poverty my father did." I want him stripped of everything, his home, his gold, his name. Alaric, see to it that by tonight, this man is a beggar in the streets of the village he helped destroy. Alaric looked up at her, a flash of genuine awe crossing his features. And the others? The same, Elara said, tossing the knife onto the table. It stood quivering in the wood. I want them to watch as I take back everything they stole, and I want them to know it was a Thorne who did it for me. The return. On the ride back to the manor, the rain began to fall, a cold, cleansing deluge. Alaric rode close to her, his hand occasionally reaching out to steady her horse. When they reached the gates, he helped her down, his hands lingering on her waist. You're learning, he murmured, his face close to hers, shielded from the rain by the overhang of the carriage house. You're more ruthless than I ever was. You didn't just break him. You erased him. I had a good teacher, Elara replied, her fingers tangling in the wet fabric of his shirt. The tension between them snapped. Alaric slammed her back against the stone wall, his mouth crashing onto hers in a kiss that tasted of rain, salt, and shared darkness. It wasn't a kiss of love. It was a kiss of mutual destruction. He kissed her like a man possessed, his hands roaming over her body as if trying to memorize the shape of his new goddess. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers, both of them gasping for air. I am your dog, Elara, he rasped, his eyes burning with a terrifying, beautiful madness. Lead me to the next throat. Just don't ever look away from me. The storm that had pursued them from the lowlands finally broke over Thorne Manor. A deafening roar of thunder and rhythmic lashing, of rain that mirrored the chaos in their veins. They didn't enter through the grand foyer. They moved through the side entrance, dripping, breathless, and tethered by an invisible, tightening wire of shared violence and newfound power. Chapter 10. The Submission. Inside the master suite, the only light came from the dying, embers of the hearth and the strobing flashes of lightning against the tall windows. Alaric didn't call for a servant. He didn't call for wine. He simply kicked the door shut, the heavy thud echoing like a gavel. He turned to her, his wet hair plastered to his forehead, his leather gear slick with rain. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and found he preferred the heat. You have the gold, he rasped, his eyes fixed on the iron box she still held. You have the reputation of a man who thought he was untouchable. Are you satisfied, Elara? Elara set the box on the mahogany table with a heavy thud. She slowly began to unpin her hair, the wet strands falling like dark silk over her shoulders. Satisfied? No, Alaric. I'm just beginning to understand the weight of the crown you've placed on my head. The unraveling. She walked toward him, her movements slow and predatory. She stopped inches from him, the scent of the rain-drenched forest and cold iron radiating from his skin. She reached out, her fingers trembling, only slightly as she began to unbuckle the leather harness. Across his chest. You said you were mine, she whispered, her voice a low vibration that seemed to command the very air. You said you were my weapon. Prove it. Alaric stood perfectly still. He was a man built for action, for striking first. Yet he remained motionless under her touch. The only sign of his internal struggle was the muscle jumping in his jaw and the way his breath hitched as her fingers brushed the skin beneath his shirt. How? He asked, his voice dropping to a gravelly depth. Undress, she commanded. The word hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Alaric's eyes darkened, a flash of the old, dominant vulture flickering in the gray depths before it was extinguished by a primal, terrifyingly beautiful submission. He obeyed. He shed the leather, the damp wool and the boots, until he stood before her in the firelight, a landscape of hard muscle and silver scars. The bandage on his shoulder was gone, replaced by a jagged, red raw line, the mark of her saving him. The peak of power. Elara traced the scar with her thumb. He flinched, not from pain, but from the sheer intensity of the contact. You did this for me, she murmured, looking up at him. You took a bullet for a girl you thought you owned, and now you're kneeling for a woman you know you can never truly have. I am whatever you need me to be, Alaric growled. He sank to his knees on the thick rug before the fire, his hands resting on his thighs, his gaze never leaving hers. It was an act of total vulnerability, a king surrendering his throne to the one who had survived his siege. I have spent my life taking. With you, I only want to be consumed. Elara placed her hands on his shoulders, Feeling the raw power he was suppressing just to remain still for her, she leaned down, her lips brushing against his ear, her voice a silk-wrapped blade. Then remember this feeling, Alaric. Remember that the world thinks you are a monster, but I know you are a servant. You belong to the dead. You belong to me. The explosion. The tension snapped like a dry branch. Alaric's restraint broke, but not into aggression, into a desperate, starving need. He reached up, his large hands framing her face, his thumbs grazing her lips. Then rule me, Elara, he whispered, his voice breaking. Rule me until there is nothing left of the man who hurt you. He pulled her down into a kiss that was a collision of everything they had been through, the fear, the lies, the revenge, and the twisted, dark love that had grown in the shadows of Thorne Manor. It was a kiss that tasted of surrender. He lifted her, her wet skirts clinging to his skin, and carried her to the bed. In the dark, surrounded by the scent of wood smoke and the sound of the storm, the power play reached its zenith. There was no longer a captor and a prisoner. There was only a man trying to find redemption in the woman he had tried to break, and a woman finding her strength in the man she had finally conquered. As the fire died down to white ash, Alaric held her with a grip that suggested he would never let go, even if the world burned around them. The silence that followed was heavy but no longer suffocating. It was the first true silence Alaric had known since his mother's death, a silence not born of loneliness, but of arrival. He lay back against the headboard, pulling the heavy furs over them both. Elara rested her head on his chest, her hair a wild dark spill across his skin. He watched the last glow of the embers, his hand hovering just inches above her shoulder. He felt like a man holding a glass sculpture in a hurricane. He was terrified that the slightest movement would, shatter the reality of her being there by her own choice. You're thinking about the ledger again, Elara whispered against his skin. She didn't have to look at him to know the rhythm of his thoughts. Alaric let out a breath he'd been holding for a lifetime. You're thinking about the man who wrote it. My father didn't just steal your family's future, Elara. He stole my soul before I was old enough to know I had one. He fed me on a diet of hate and I devoured it gladly. He looked down at his hand, the hand that had signed warrants and held blades. I look at these fingers, and I wonder if they are capable of anything other than breaking things. Elara sat up slightly, the fur slipping to her waist. She took his hand in hers, interlacing their fingers. You didn't break me, Alaric. You tried. You bent me until I thought I would snap. But you gave me the whetstone to sharpen myself. You wanted a weapon? You got one. But you didn't realize that a weapon can choose its target. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. You've spent your life paying a debt that wasn't yours. Stop looking at the past. Look at the woman who is standing here. Alaric closed his eyes, his grip on her hand tightening with a desperate grounding force. If we survive tomorrow, he murmured, I will spend the rest of my life ensuring you never have to be a weapon again. I will build you a world where the only thing you have to lead is me. The silence that followed was heavy but no longer suffocating. It was the first true silence Alaric had known since his mother's death, a silence not born of loneliness, but of arrival. He lay back against the headboard, pulling the heavy furs over them both. Elara rested her head on his chest, her hair a wild dark spill across his skin. He watched the last glow of the embers, his hand hovering just inches above her shoulder. He felt like a man holding a glass sculpture in a hurricane. He was terrified that the slightest movement would, shatter the reality of her being there by her own choice. You're thinking about the ledger again, Elara whispered against his skin. She didn't have to look at him to know the rhythm of his thoughts. Alaric let out a breath he'd been holding for a lifetime. You're thinking about the man who wrote it. My father didn't just steal your family's future, Elara. He stole my soul before I was old enough to know I had one. He fed me on a diet of hate and I devoured it gladly. He looked down at his hand, the hand that had signed warrants and held blades. I look at these fingers, and I wonder if they are capable of anything other than breaking things. Elara sat up slightly, the fur slipping to her waist. She took his hand in hers, interlacing their fingers. You didn't break me, Alaric. You tried. You bent me until I thought I would snap. But you gave me the whetstone to sharpen myself. You wanted a weapon? You got one. But you didn't realize that a weapon can choose its target. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. You've spent your life paying a debt that wasn't yours. Stop looking at the past. Look at the woman who is standing here. Alaric closed his eyes, his grip on her hand tightening with a desperate, grounding force. If we survive tomorrow, he murmured, I will spend the rest of my life ensuring you never have to be a weapon again. I will build you a world where the only thing you have to lead is me. I don't want a world without shadows, Alaric, she whispered, pulling him down into a final soft kiss. I just want a world where we aren't the ones casting them. I won't let Julian take this, he murmured into her hair, his voice fierce and low. I won't let him touch the world we've built in this room. He's coming, isn't he? Elara asked, her voice steady despite the exhaustion. He's already here, Alaric replied, his eyes turning toward the door as a distant, rhythmic knocking began to echo from the great hall below. The rhythmic pounding on the heavy oak doors below was not the frantic beat of an intruder. It was the measured, arrogant summons of a man who believed he had already won. The sound vibrated through the floorboards of the master suite, chilling the air that only moments ago had been thick with the heat of Alaric's surrender. Chapter 11. The Arrival of the Rival. Alaric was out of bed in a heartbeat. The vulnerability of the previous hour disappeared, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged lethalness. He didn't reach for his silk robe. He reached for his shirt and the leather holsters that sat on the nightstand. Stay here, he commanded, his voice returning to that frigid Lord of the Manor tone. No, Elara said, rising from the tangled sheets. She wrapped herself in a velvet robe of deep crimson, her hair a wild halo around her face. You said I rule you. That means I don't hide while you face your ghosts. Alaric looked at her, a flicker of pride and fear crossing his face. He nodded once. Together they descended the grand staircase. The paper coup. Julian stood in the center of the great hall, flanked by two men in the black robes of the High Court and a small contingent of the king's guard. He wasn't armed with a sword. He was holding a scroll sealed with the royal wax of the capital. He looked up as they descended, a slow, sickening smile spreading across his face. Brother, Julian said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. You look disheveled. It seems the rumors of your decline weren't exaggerated. Get out of my house, Julian, Alaric growled, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. Before I forget that we share a name. Julian didn't flinch. He stepped forward, holding out the scroll. It isn't your house anymore, Alaric. By order of the High Magistrate, your assets have been frozen and your title suspended. You are being charged with the gross mismanagement of the Thorne legacy and, more importantly, with mental instability. He gestured toward Elara, his eyes lingering on her with a predatory grease. Using a high-born debt to keep a village girl as a concubine, forcing her to handle the ledgers of the North. The court sees this not as business, but as the delusions of a man lost to his own twisted obsessions. The trap closes. One of the robed men stepped forward. Lord Alaric, the evidence provided by your brother suggests you have been under the undue influence of this woman. We are here to escort you to the capital for evaluation. The girl will be taken into custody as a witness to your episodes. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. This was Julian's true revenge. He didn't want to kill Alaric. He wanted to hollow him out. He wanted to take the manor, the name, and the woman Alaric had finally admitted he couldn't live without. I am the evidence. Elara stepped forward, her voice ringing out in the hollow hall. She looked at the magistrates, then at Julian. I am the one who balanced the ledgers Julian couldn't read. I am the one who saved Alaric's life in the Blackwood forest when Julian's hired dogs tried to slit his throat. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A prisoner defending her captor. A classic symptom of the madness he has forced upon you. The inversion of the debt. Alaric stepped in front of Elara, but he didn't draw his weapon. He knew that to shed blood here, in front of the king's guard, would be to sign his own death warrant. He looked at Julian, his eyes like two chips of flint. You want the estate, Julian? You want the gold? Alaric's voice was dangerously quiet. Take it, but you touch her, and I will ensure that the only thing you inherit is a grave. He's not himself. Julian cried out to the guards. See how he threatens his own blood? Secure him! As the guards moved forward, Elara realized that the ledger, the truth about Silas Thorne, was their only weapon. But if she revealed it now, it would only prove that Alaric had been keeping secrets, potentially fueling the claim of his instability. She looked at Alaric. In the chaos of the guards closing in, he reached back and squeezed her hand. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a signal. "The East Wing," he whispered, so low only she could hear. "The loose stone under Seraphina's portrait. Go now." As the guards laid hands on Alaric, he didn't fight back. He allowed them to pin his arms, his gaze fixed on Julian with a chilling promise of future violence. In the confusion of Alaric's submission to the law, Elara slipped into the shadows of the hallway, disappearing before Julian could call for her. The manor is no longer a sanctuary. It's a hunting ground. Alaric is being dragged away, and Elara is a fugitive in the house she just learned to rule. The cold stone of the East Wing felt like ice against Elara's bare feet as she sprinted through the shadows. The sounds of the struggle in the great hall, the clatter of armor, the muffled shouts, and the heavy thud of the front doors echoed through the vents like the dying gasps of a beast. She reached the ironwood door of the gallery, her breath coming in ragged hitches. Her fingers grappled for the handle, but before she could throw her weight against it, a hand clamped firmly over her mouth. Chapter 12, The Betrayal. Elara was slammed back against the moth-eaten wallpaper. The scent of cloying rosewater and expensive brandy filled her senses. Julian. He didn't have Alaric's raw, masculine heat. He smelled of a man who used perfume to hide the scent of decay. "Shh," Julian hissed, his face inches from hers. His eyes were a pale, watery blue, lacking the stormy depth of his brother's. "The guards are looking for you, little bird. They have orders to restrain you, and believe me, their hands are much rougher than mine." He slowly released his hand. Elara didn't scream. She knew that in this house, silence was the only shield she had left. "What do you want, Julian?" She spat, smoothing her crimson robe. "The devil's bargain." Julian leaned against the doorframe, looking casually at his manicured fingernails. "I want to offer you the one thing Alaric never could: truth and freedom." He stepped closer, invading her space with a predatory confidence. "My brother is a collector of broken things. He didn't bring you here to settle a debt. He brought you here to be a mirror for his own self-loathing. He looks at you and sees the girl he should have protected, the girl he wants to ruin, and the woman he's terrified of all at once. That isn't love, Elara, that's a pathology. And you're any better?" Elara countered. "You're stealing his birthright with a piece of paper." "I am saving the Thorne name," Julian snapped, his facade of charm cracking for a second. "And I'm offering you a way out. Testify to the High Court. Tell them he's prone to violent outbursts. Tell them he forced you into his bed and made you handle the ledgers as a form of psychological torture. If you do that, the debt is vanished. I will give you 10,000 gold pieces and a carriage to any city in the kingdom. Your father will live like a king for the rest of his days. The mirror of the soul." Elara looked at him, her mind racing. She thought of the ledger in the safe, the proof that Julian's father had started this cycle of lies. She thought of Alaric kneeling before her in the firelight, surrendering his power to her. "Why do you need my testimony?" she asked, her voice low. "If you have the warrants, why me?" "Because Alaric is popular with the local lords," Julian admitted, pacing the narrow hallway. "They see him as a strong, if cold, leader. But if his victim, the innocent girl he kidnapped, stands before the court and describes his madness, he'll be locked in a stone cell in the sanitarium for the rest of his life. No one will ever question my right to the throne then." He stopped and looked at her, his eyes shining with a sickening hope. "Imagine it, Elara, no more shadows, no more blood-stained gowns. Just your life back. The life you had before the Vulture circled your home." The calculated move. Elara looked toward the gallery door, where the portrait of Seraphina waited in the dark. She realized that Julian didn't know about the ledger. He didn't know that she already held the key to destroying the Thorne legacy. If she accepted, she could get close to the High Court and reveal the truth about both brothers. If she refused, she'd be thrown into a dungeon, and Alaric would be lost forever. "And if I say no?" she asked. Julian's expression turned stone cold. He reached out, his fingers catching a lock of her hair and twisting it painfully. "Then you are an accomplice to a madman. You'll be tried alongside him, and the king's justice is far less merciful than I am." He let go of her hair and held out his hand, palm up. "Which is it, Elara? The gold and the sunlight, or the cell and the vulture?" Elara looked at his hand, then up at his face. She forced her expression to soften, to look like the fragile girl Julian expected to see. She placed her hand in his, her skin crawling at the contact. "Tell me where to sign," she whispered. Julian's smile was triumphant, the smile of a man who thought he had just bought the world. He didn't see the cold, calculating fire in Elara's eyes. He didn't realize that she wasn't choosing him. She was choosing the most direct path to the throat of her enemies, the game of shadows. Elara is now a double agent, playing a dangerous game with the most treacherous man in the north. The carriage ride to the capital was a journey through a landscape of weeping gray skies and skeletal trees. Inside the cramped, velvet-lined box, the air was stagnant. Julian sat across from Elara, sipping wine from a silver flask, looking every bit the victor. Alaric was miles ahead, transported in a heavy iron cage wagon under the guard of men Julian had handpicked. The carriage ride to the capital was a journey through a landscape of weeping gray skies and skeletal trees. Inside the cramped, velvet-lined box, the air was stagnant. Julian sat across from Elara, sipping wine from a silver flask, looking every bit the victor. Alaric was miles ahead, transported in a heavy iron cage wagon under the guard of men Julian had handpicked. Chapter 13, The Twist, Part 2. Julian was talkative in his triumph. He viewed Elara as a conquered prize, a girl who had finally seen sense. He spent the hours detailing his plans for the estate. How he would tear down the east wing, sell the Blackwood timber, and turn the manor into a palace of light and vice. "You've made the right choice, Elara," he said, his voice oily. "My brother was always too heavy. Too much brooding, too much honor mixed with his cruelty. It's exhausting to live that way." The letter in the lining. An hour from the capital, the carriage hit a deep rut in the road. The jolt was violent, knocking Julian's flask from his hand and sending it skittering under Elara's seat. As she leaned down to retrieve it, her hand brushed against a loose seam in the carriage's upholstery. She felt the crinkle of paper. Hidden within the silk lining was a bundle of letters, bound with a ribbon that smelled faintly of the same cloying rosewater Julian wore. While Julian was distracted, shouting out the window at the driver to watch the road, Elara slipped the bundle into the folds of her robe. Minutes later, under the guise of adjusting her cloak, she read the top letter. It wasn't from a business associate or a lover. It was a confession addressed to no one, a draft of a letter their father, Silas, must have found before he died. The poison worked slower than the doctor promised. Mother looked at me as she died, and for a moment I thought she knew. But she only reached for Alaric's hand. She always reached for him. Even as her lungs filled with fluid, she loved the strong son. "I have cleared the path, Father. Now Alaric is the only thing left between me and the throne." The blood in Elara's veins turned to liquid nitrogen. Julian hadn't just framed her father. He had murdered his own mother to isolate Alaric and accelerate his inheritance. The fatal discovery. Elara didn't have time to process the horror. The carriage slowed as they approached a bridge overlooking a churning black river. Julian turned back to her, his eyes narrowing as he noticed the corner of the paper peeking out from her sleeve. The mask of the charming brother shattered. His face twisted into something reptilian and cold. "You have a habit of looking where you shouldn't, Elara," Julian said, his voice a low, lethal whisper. He didn't wait for her to deny it. He reached across the carriage, his hand wrapping around her throat with a strength she didn't know he possessed. He pinned her against the door, the letters fluttering to the floor. "It doesn't matter," Julian hissed, his face inches from hers. "You've already signed the deposition. The court has your written word that Alaric is mad. Once we reach the gates, you'll have an accident on the bridge." A grieving witness overcome by the trauma of her captivity, throwing herself into the rapids. It's almost poetic, the struggle. Elara clawed at his wrists, her vision blurring as he squeezed. "He will kill you," she gasped. "He'll be in a padded cell. Elara, he'll never even know. You're dead until the water has stripped the skin from your bones." Julian reached for the carriage door handle, intending to shove her out into the path of the following guards or over the bridge's edge. But Elara wasn't the girl from the village anymore. She was a woman who had learned the weight of a blade and the power of a hunter. She reached into her hair, pulling out the heavy, sharpened silver pin Alaric had given her for the ball. With a guttural cry, she drove it into Julian's thigh. He screamed, his grip on her throat loosening as he recoiled. Elara didn't hesitate. She threw herself against the carriage door, which swung open with a violent creak. The wind whipped her hair as she teetered on the edge of the moving vehicle. "The debt isn't paid, Julian," she screamed over the roar of the wheels. "Not until your head is on the floor." She jumped. The final reckoning. Elara has survived the jump, but she is alone in the woods miles from the capital, while Alaric is being led to his evaluation, which is likely a death sentence. The impact with the forest floor was a jarring symphony of pain. Elara rolled through the damp undergrowth, her crimson velvet robe tearing against brambles and sharp stones. She came to a halt at the edge of a ravine, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. Above, the carriage roared onward, Julian's curses lost to the wind. But as she pulled herself up, the pain was eclipsed by a cold, crystalline clarity. She looked at her hands, scraped and bloodied, and remembered Alaric's voice in the woods. "In this house, you are either the wolf or the lamb." The lamb had died on that bridge. Chapter 14. The Blood Moon. The sun was sinking, bleeding a deep, bruised red across the horizon, a blood moon rising. Elara knew the geography of these woods. She had studied Alaric's maps during her lessons. The transport wagon carrying Alaric was heavy and slow, forced to take the lower pass, while the carriage had taken the high road. If she cut through the Devil's Throat, a narrow, jagged pass, she could get ahead of them. The ambush. She moved like a shadow, the adrenaline numbing the ache in her twisted ankle. She reached the pass just as the rhythmic thumping of heavy horses echoed against the stone walls. The transport was guarded by only 4 men, Julian's loyalists. They were arrogant, laughing about the mad lord they were delivering to the gallows. They didn't see the girl perched on the ledge above. Elara didn't have a rifle, but she had the environment. She loosened the heavy, rain-soaked logs. Alaric's workers had piled at the cliff's edge for the winter mills. With a heave that strained every muscle in her body, she kicked the wedge free. The timber descended like a localized earthquake. The lead horses reared, screaming, as the logs crashed down, blocking the path and sending one guard plunging into the ravine. In the chaos, Elara slid down the embankment, the sharpened silver hairpin clutched in her fist. She didn't hesitate. She was a blur of crimson and fury. She used the guard's confusion, striking the first man in the throat before he could draw his sword. The second man lunged, but she parried with a fallen branch, driving her heel into his knee, a move Alaric had shown her in the sparring ring. "The key," she screamed, her voice a primal roar. The third guard, terrified by the sight of the debt girl turned banshee, dropped the iron ring of keys and fled into the dark. The Vulture unleashed. Elara scrambled to the back of the iron cage. Inside, Alaric was shackled, his face bruised, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and adoration. "Elara," he whispered, his voice a ghost. She didn't speak. She fumbled with the lock, the iron groaning as it finally gave way. The door swung open and Alaric stepped out, his chains clattering against the stone. He looked at the bodies, then at the blood on her face. He didn't check his wounds. He grabbed her, pulling her into a crushing embrace, his forehead resting against hers. "You shouldn't be here. You should be miles away." "I have the letters, Alaric," she gasped, pulling the crumpled papers from her bodice. "Julian killed your mother. He's the one who poisoned her. He's at the bridge. He's waiting for the guards to report my death." The air around Alaric seemed to freeze. A sound escaped him, not a cry but a low, guttural growl that felt like the earth splitting open. The gray in his eyes vanished, replaced by a void of pure, lethal intent. He picked up a fallen guard's broadsword, the weight of it looking natural in his hand. "He wants a madman?" Alaric rasped, his grip tightening on the hilt until his knuckles turned white. "I will give him a monster." The final confrontation. They reached the bridge as the moon turned a deep, sinister crimson. Julian stood by the stone railing, looking down at the churning water, waiting for a body that would never float by. "Where are they?" Julian muttered to himself, checking his gold watch. "They should have signaled." "They're dead, Julian." Alaric's voice came from the mouth of the bridge. He walked out of the fog, his chains dragging behind him like the tail of a vengeful spirit. Beside him stood Elara, her red robe tattered, looking like a queen of the underworld. Julian's face went white. He scrambled back, drawing his rapier. "Guards, guards, to me!" But there were no guards left, only the wind and the roar of the river. "You killed her," Alaric said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He stepped onto the bridge, the sword leveled at his brother's heart. You watched her die and you let me believe it was my fault. You let me grow up in a house of ghosts, while you walked the halls with her. Blood on your hands. She loved you more. Julian screamed, his composure finally shattering into a jagged mess of envy. Everything was for Alaric. The estate, the title, the love. I was just the spare, the shadow. I did what I had to do. He lunged a desperate, clumsy thrust. Alaric parried it with a contemptuous flick of his wrist. He didn't end it quickly. He systematically dismantled Julian, a series of shallow cuts that forced his brother back toward the edge of the bridge. This isn't for the title, Julian, Alaric growled, pinning Julian's sword arm against the stone railing. This is for the debt. The real debt. Alaric looked back at Elara. The choice was hers. This was the final submission, the master asking the queen for the sentence. Elara walked forward. She looked at Julian, the man who had tried to kill her, the man who had ruined her father's life for a few bags of gold. She saw the letters in her hand, the proof of his rot. The world needs to know the truth, Alaric, she said, her voice cold. But the river doesn't care about the truth. Alaric nodded. With a roar of pure, cathartic rage, he drove his shoulder into Julian's chest, sending his brother over the low railing. Julian didn't even have time to scream before the black water swallowed him whole. The war's over. The brother's blood has been spilled, and the truth is in Elara's hands. The aftermath of the blood moon left Thorne Manor in a state of eerie, hollow stillness. The High Court had been presented with the letters. Julian's body had never been recovered from the rapids, and the Blackwood name had been cleared in every corner of the kingdom. The debt was gone. The shackles were broken. Chapter 15, The Departure. The snow began to fall again, but this time it was soft, silent, and clean. Elara stood in the center of the great hall, dressed not in obsidian silk or bruised violet, but in her own simple wool coat, the one she had arrived in. Beside her sat a small trunk. She wasn't a prisoner, and she wasn't a queen. She was simply Elara. The final walk. Alaric descended the stairs. He didn't move with the predatory grace of the Vulture tonight. He walked slowly, his shoulders stiff from the wounds that would likely leave a permanent mark. He stopped on the final step, the same place they had first met. The silence between them was heavy, pregnant with everything they had done to and for each other. "The carriage is ready," Alaric said. His voice was a rasp, stripped of its usual command. "Your father is waiting in the village. I've sent the gold ahead. It's more than enough to buy back the shop, the land, and a dozen lives besides." "Thank you, Alaric," Elara said softly. She looked around the hall. The chandeliers were dim, and the shadows seemed to be retreating. The manor no longer felt like a predator. It felt like a grave that had finally been closed. "You're really leaving," Alaric stated. It wasn't a question. It was a realization that seemed to age him a decade in a single breath. "I have to," Elara replied, stepping toward him. She reached out, her fingers brushing the lapel of his coat. "If I stay, I'll always be the girl who settled the debt. I'll always be the ghost in the east. Wing, I need to find out who I am when I'm not being watched by a thorn." The heart-wrenching choice. Alaric's hand flew to her wrist, not with the bruising grip of a captor, but with the desperate, trembling hold of a man drowning. He pulled her closer, his eyes searching hers with a raw, naked agony. "I would give it all up," he whispered, his forehead dropping to hers. "The manor, the title, the land. I would burn it all to the ground if it meant you'd look at me without seeing a cage. I don't see a cage anymore." "Alaric," she whispered back, a single tear tracing a path through the faint scars on her cheek. "I see a man who was broken by the same lies that broke me. But we can't heal here. Not like this." Alaric closed his eyes, his breath hitching. This was his final test. He had spent his life taking what he wanted, seizing power and holding on to it with iron claws. To let her go was to go against every instinct he possessed. It was a greater sacrifice than taking a bullet. He slowly, painfully released her wrist. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small iron key, the key to the front gates. He didn't give it to her. He walked over to the massive front doors and threw them open himself. The winter air rushed in, cold and sweet. "Go," he said, his back to her, his shoulders shaking. "Before I find a reason to stop you. Before the Vulture comes back. The new path." Elara picked up her trunk. She walked to the threshold, stopping for one last look at the man's silhouette against the firelight. "Alaric?" He didn't turn. "The debt is paid," she said firmly, "but the ledger is still open. If you ever find a way to be the man who knelt in the firelight without the shadows of your father, find me." She stepped out into the snow. The heavy iron gates of Thorne Manor did not groan as she passed. They stood silent, granting her the freedom she had earned in blood. As the carriage pulled away, she looked back at the darkening cliffs. For a fleeting second, she saw a figure standing on the balcony of the east wing, watching her until the snow in the distance turned the obsidian manor into nothing more than a memory. Elara turned her gaze forward, toward the village, toward her father, and toward a horizon that was no longer a cage. The shadow in the trees a healing year. The moon was a thin sliver over the Blackwood Valley, providing just enough light to silver the frost on the pines. Alaric stood at the edge of the tree line, his dark cloak blending into the bark of an ancient oak. He was miles away from his throne, far from the ledgers and the ghosts of his father, standing in the dirt like a common traveler. He shouldn't have been there. He had promised her freedom, and freedom meant a life lived without the weight of his gaze. But tonight the silence of the manor had been too loud, the halls too wide without the sound of her obsidian skirts, the sight of the sun. Down in the valley, the Blackwood workshop was a lantern in the dark. The windows glowed with a warm amber light that spilled onto the cobblestones. Then the door opened. Elara stepped out onto the porch. She was carrying a basket of wood shavings, her hair tied back in a messy, practical braid. She wasn't wearing the emerald silk or the violet velvet he had forced upon her. She wore a simple dress of homespun linen, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Alaric's breath hitched in his throat. He watched as she took a deep breath of the night air, her shoulders relaxing in a way they never had within the walls of Thorne Manor. She looked light. The shadows that had once lived under her eyes were gone, replaced by the healthy glow of a woman who owned her own time. The moment of connection. She began to scatter the shavings for the garden mulch, her movements fluid and peaceful. Suddenly she stopped. She tilted her head, her gaze drifting toward the dark tree line where Alaric stood perfectly still. For a heartbeat, Alaric feared she could see him, that his obsession was a physical thing that could be felt across the distance. He prepared himself to retreat, to vanish back into the darkness like the phantom he feared he still was. But Elara didn't look afraid. She didn't call for her father or reach for a weapon. Instead, she stood there for a long moment, looking into the dark with a soft, knowing expression. She reached up, her fingers grazing the spot on her neck where the diamond choker had once sat, and then she smiled. It wasn't a smile for a captor. It was a smile for a memory. The vow. "I'm coming back, Elara," Alaric whispered into the wind, his voice so low even the leaves didn't stir. "But not until I am a man who can stand in that light without extinguishing it." He watched her go back inside, the door closing with a soft thud that echoed in his chest. He stayed for another hour, guarding her sleep from the edge of the woods, a silent sentinel for the woman who had taught him that the greatest power wasn't in holding someone close, but in being worthy of their return. When he finally turned to walk back toward the manor, his step was lighter. He had seen the sun, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the dawn. The air in the valley was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and damp earth. It was exactly 365 days since the gates of Thorne Manor had closed behind her. Elara was at the workbench behind her house, her hands stained with cedar oil. She was focused on the intricate carving of a jewelry box, a gift for a village girl's wedding, when the atmosphere changed. The birds in the nearby thicket didn't stop singing, but the cadence of the wind felt different. Then she heard the click of the latch on the front gate. The reunion, the year of the Vulture's end. Elara wiped her hands on her apron and walked around the corner of the cottage. She stopped dead. Alaric stood by the gate. He wasn't the man she had left. The sharp, predatory edges of his silhouette had been softened by a year of travel and labor. He wore a simple traveling cloak, his boots caked with the dust of the southern roads. But it was his eyes, once the cold, turbulent gray of a winter sea, that stopped her heart. They were clear. They were quiet. For a long minute, neither of them moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. The first words. "You're late," Elara said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain steady. "The sun set 5 minutes ago." Alaric's mouth twitched, a ghost of the arrogant smirk he used to wear, but now tempered with a profound humility. I walked the last 10 miles. I didn't want to arrive on a war horse. I thought a man should walk toward his future on his own 2 feet. He took a tentative step forward, stopping well outside her personal space. I finished it, Elara. Every name in that ledger has been answered with justice, not blood. The Thorne name no longer tastes like ash in the mouth of the valley. The emotional explosion. Elara felt the wall she had built around her heart over the last year begin to crumble. I didn't think you'd actually do it. I thought the Manor would pull you back in. I thought the Vulture would find another cage. The Vulture died on that bridge with Julian, Alaric said, his voice dropping to a raw, jagged depth. He stepped closer, the heat of his presence beginning to envelop her. I spent a year trying to find a version of myself that was worthy of standing in your garden. I spent every night talking to the ghost of you because I was too terrified that the real you would look at me and see nothing but a monster. Elara's breath hitched. The composure she had fought so hard to maintain shattered. She covered the distance between them in 3 frantic strides, her hands slamming into his chest, not to push him away but to make sure he was real. "You fool," she sobbed, her forehead crashing against his collarbone. "I didn't want a perfect man. I just wanted the one who let me go." The final submission. Alaric's arms wrapped around her with the force of a man reclaiming his soul. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot and ragged against her skin. He was shaking, the great lord of the north, reduced to a heap of nerves and longing. "I missed you," he rasped into her hair. "Gods, Elara, every sunset was a torment because you weren't there to see it. Every victory was hollow because I couldn't tell you about it." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. He didn't ask. He didn't command. He simply waited. Elara reached up, her stained fingers framing his face, tracing the new lines of character and travel around his eyes. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that wasn't a battle or a debt, but a homecoming. "The year is over, Alaric," she whispered against his mouth. "Come inside. The jasmine is blooming, and I think I'm ready to see what the next chapter looks like." Alaric didn't pick her up or sweep her away. He simply took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, and together they walked toward the small, lit-up cottage, leaving the shadows of the obsidian throne behind them forever. The end.